A single scream echoed through the hallway of a student dorm in Ann Arbor. Door slammed shut, then silence. On the night of October 7th, 2010, 20-year-old journalism student Hannah Blake disappeared without a trace. Her laptop was left open on her desk, her coffee still warm, her car untouched in the parking lot. Within hours, her life simply stopped. For more than 10 years, her case gathered dust in the cold files of Michigan until a shocking discovery inside the wall of an abandoned student house forced the truth back into the light. Subscribe and follow this case, because the truth hidden inside that wall was darker than anyone imagined. The evening of Thursday, October 7th, 2010, began like any other for 20-year-old Hannah Blake. She was a second-year journalism student at the University of Michigan, known for her sharp writing and relentless curiosity. Friends described her as the kind of student who carried a notebook everywhere, constantly scribbling down ideas for stories. That night, she attended a late editorial meeting at the campus newspaper office, tucked into the basement of a brick building near State Street. The meeting broke up around 11. Hannah stayed behind a few minutes to finish formatting an article on her laptop. Several classmates recalled her saying, "I'll walk home. It's only a few blocks." She left carrying her worn leather bag, her laptop inside, and a light jacket slung over her shoulder. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Ann Arbor's October air was cool and damp that night, with a drizzle that made the streets shimmer under the orange glow of the lamps. The walk to her apartment should have taken less than 10 minutes. Investigators later reconstructed her route across State Street, down toward Packard, and then to the small student complex where she lived with another journalism major. At 11:15, a neighbor in the complex reported hearing hurried footsteps in the hallway, followed by a single slam of a door. She assumed it was just another student returning late. What she could not know was that those sounds would become the final audible trace of Hannah Blake. When her roommate came home the next morning, she found the apartment strangely unsettled. The desk lamp was still on, illuminating Hannah's laptop screen with an unfinished article draft. A mug of coffee sat half full, the liquid forming a thin film on the surface. Hannah's keys were missing, along with her backpack, but her phone charger was still plugged in with no phone attached. On the couch was Hannah's coat, which raised immediate concern. She had left into the chilly night without it. By noon on October 8th, Hannah's parents, who lived in Grand Rapids, were calling her phone repeatedly. Each call went straight to voicemail. When the roommate realized Hannah had not returned at all, she contacted the campus police. Within hours, the case escalated to Ann Arbor Police Department. The initial search focused on her most common paths: the library, the newsroom, and the nearby cafes she frequented. Flyers were printed by classmates within 24 hours, Hannah's photograph pinned to bulletin boards and taped to lampposts. Her blue sedan, parked in the apartment lot, remained untouched, eliminating the possibility that she had driven away. Investigators pressed friends for details. One recalled a strange remark Hannah made earlier that week. She had been working on a student feature about unsafe housing conditions and mentioned that some stories are bigger than they look. At the time, no one thought much of it. After her disappearance, it carried a chilling weight. Police canvassed the area, questioning residents who lived near the apartment. Several remembered seeing a man in a dark hoodie loitering around the complex that night. None could describe his face clearly, and no security cameras were positioned to capture the entrance. With no forced entry into Hannah's apartment, detectives believed she had either been followed home or lured into opening her door. By the end of that first weekend, fear spread across campus. Students traveled in groups at night. Local newspapers ran headlines about the missing journalism major. Still, there was no trace, no credit card use, no phone activity, No sightings that held up under scrutiny. For the Blake family, those first nights were unbearable. Her mother described sitting by the phone, convinced it would ring with Hannah's voice. Her father drove the streets of Ann Arbor, stopping at bus stations, gas stations, anywhere a frightened young woman might appear. Each night ended in the same silence. That Thursday night, which began with the normal rhythms of student life, had already slipped into legend. A young woman walked home, carrying her notes and stories, and vanished in less than 10 minutes of darkness. The unanswered questions left behind were as stark as the glow of her desk lamp. Where did Hannah go? Who was in the hallway that night? And why did her life freeze in an instant, leaving behind only a cup of cooling coffee and words she would never finish? When Hannah Blake failed to appear for her morning journalism class on Friday, October 8, 2010. Her absence was noticed almost immediately. She was known for her reliability, often arriving early with a notebook in hand. By noon, both her roommate and her professors were concerned. When repeated phone calls went unanswered, her family was notified. Within hours, a missing person report was filed. The first wave of the search began that same afternoon. Campus police checked the usual places students might be: libraries, coffee shops, computer labs. Her car was still parked outside the apartment complex, eliminating the idea that she had simply driven off. Investigators entered her room and found the unsettling scene that would become central to the case. The desk lamp still glowing, the laptop open, a coffee mug abandoned mid-sip, and her jacket neatly folded on the couch. It looked as though she had stepped out for only a minute, yet she had never returned. Flyers were printed almost immediately, Hannah's smile appearing on hundreds of sheets taped to street poles, shop windows, and campus bulletin boards. Her parents arrived from Grand Rapids that evening, joining classmates in passing out the first wave of flyers across Ann Arbor. The phrase, "Have you seen Hannah?" became familiar on every corner of the university district. By Saturday morning, volunteers gathered in the dozens. They formed search parties that combed through wooded areas, riverbanks, and the narrow streets around her apartment. Police dogs were brought in, trained to follow scent trails from Hannah's belongings. The dogs managed to track her scent as far as the stairwell of her building, then out into the street. But within a few hundred feet, the trail disappeared. Investigators would later note that the sudden loss of scent suggested she had likely been taken into a vehicle. Witness statements began to filter in, but they were conflicting. A neighbor in the complex reported hearing hurried footsteps late on Thursday night, followed by a door slamming. Another claimed to have seen a man in a dark hoodie standing near the stairwell around the same time. A third insisted they heard voices raised in argument from somewhere in the building. None of these accounts aligned perfectly, and none could provide a description clear enough to identify a suspect. The search quickly grew to cover the wider Ann Arbor area. Police units checked bus stations, train depots, and even the Detroit airport just 40 miles away. Taxi companies were questioned, though none recalled picking up a passenger matching Hannah's description. Friends and classmates were interviewed repeatedly. Investigators asked about her relationships, her recent behavior, and whether she had seemed anxious or afraid. Most described her as focused on her studies, slightly stressed by deadlines, but otherwise upbeat. By Sunday night, more than 200 volunteers had participated. Search lines stretched across fields with flashlights, calling Hannah's name into the cold autumn air. K-9 units returned to the river, scanning for any sign she might have slipped or been forced into the water, but no trace was found. Helicopters hovered over wooded parks, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. Each effort ended in silence. The media quickly latched onto the story. Local news outlets broadcast images of Hannah's smiling face, describing her as a promising young journalist whose disappearance shocked the university community. National networks picked it up briefly, framing it as yet another case of a student vanishing without a trace. Reporters pressed investigators for details, but police held back, releasing only minimal information to avoid damaging the case. For Hannah's family, those first days were a nightmare of hope and despair. Her mother stood outside the police station holding her daughter's photograph, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Her father joined search parties, walking wooded trails until his legs gave out. Each evening, they returned to the apartment, where the light over Hannah's desk still burned. By the end of the first week, the momentum slowed. Leads were checked and dismissed. The search radius expanded further into the suburbs, but no new evidence appeared. Rumors began to circulate among students. Some whispered she had run away. Others speculated about a secret relationship. Each rumor added to the fog, but none brought investigators closer to the truth. The search for Hannah Blake was exhaustive, relentless, and public. Yet, despite the dozens of witnesses questioned, the miles of ground covered, and the countless flyers distributed, there was not a single solid lead. By the time the first week ended, investigators admitted they were facing a mystery that could not be solved quickly. The case of the missing journalism student had already begun to slip into the realm of something darker. Every disappearance begins with a circle of suspicion. Detectives know that in the majority of cases, the person responsible is someone close to the victim. For Hannah Blake, that meant looking first at her immediate circle of friends, classmates, and those she had once trusted. The first name that surfaced was Michael Trent, Hannah's ex-boyfriend. They had dated briefly during her freshman year. Friends described their relationship as rocky, ending after just a few months. Michael was known for his temper. He had confronted Hannah more than once in public, raising his voice when she pulled away from him. In interviews, classmates remembered Hannah saying she felt watched by him even after their breakup. Detectives called Michael in for questioning only 2 days after Hannah vanished. He appeared calm at first, insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance. His story was simple. He claimed that on the night Hannah vanished, he had been at a friend's apartment, playing video games until after midnight. But when police checked his phone records, they noticed something troubling. At 11:14 p.m., the exact window when Hannah was last seen, a call was placed from her phone to his number. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Michael admitted he received the call, but said it was nothing unusual. "She called me sometimes," he shrugged. "I don't know why." He insisted the conversation was short and that she had sounded fine. When pressed for details, he claimed he couldn't remember the exact words. Investigators were unsettled. Why would Hannah call her ex-boyfriend minutes before she disappeared? And if she did, why had Michael left this detail out in his initial statement? Despite their doubts, his alibi checked out. His friend confirmed he had been at the apartment most of the night, and cell tower data showed his phone connected to the Wi-Fi there. It wasn't airtight, but it was enough to prevent police from moving forward with charges. Michael was noted as a person of interest, but nothing more. The second figure to draw attention was Professor David Holloway, a senior lecturer in the journalism department. Whispers spread quickly among students that Hannah and Holloway had been spending time together outside of class. Some described seeing them in long conversations at cafes. Others said Hannah had mentioned he was giving her advice about a major story she was working on. When police questioned him, Holloway denied any improper relationship. He explained that Hannah was one of the most promising writers in the department, and that he had been mentoring her, nothing more. Still, rumors about the professor fueled speculation. Anonymous calls came into the tip line, suggesting Hannah might have been silenced because she knew too much about something on campus. Theories spun wildly. Corruption in housing, drugs in student fraternities, even whispers of an underground gambling ring. For detectives, it was impossible to separate fact from gossip. But one thing was clear. Hannah's determination as a journalism student had put her in contact with stories that some people might have wanted to keep hidden. Police also questioned Hannah's closest friends. Her roommate was cooperative, providing details about Hannah's routines and the night she vanished. Other classmates gave statements about her movements on campus. No one could recall her seeming frightened, though several noted she had appeared tired and distracted in the days leading up to her disappearance. By the end of October, detectives were drowning in speculation but had no hard evidence. The ex-boyfriend's half-truths raised suspicion, but his alibi was solid enough. The professor's mentorship appeared questionable, but nothing linked him directly to Hannah's last night. Each lead seemed to unravel under scrutiny. For Hannah's family, the shift in focus was devastating. Instead of clear answers, they were confronted with rumors that painted their daughter as reckless or secretive. Her mother told reporters, "Hannah was not hiding anything. She was dedicated to her work. We just want to know what happened to her." The whispers, the contradictions, the unanswered phone call. Together, they painted a picture that was both murky and chilling. Investigators began to realize this was not going to be a case solved by routine questioning. Something deeper was at play, and every day without progress pushed Hannah Blake further into the shadows of Michigan's growing list of cold cases. In the weeks following Hannah Blake's disappearance, tips flooded into the Ann Arbor Police Department. Her case dominated headlines, and every nightly broadcast ended with her smiling photograph and the plea for information. The public felt invested, and detectives were under immense pressure to deliver answers. But most of what came in only led them further away from the truth. One of the earliest calls came from Chicago. A woman insisted she had seen someone who looked exactly like Hannah at the Greyhound bus terminal. She described a young woman with brown hair, carrying a bag and appearing nervous. Investigators acted quickly, sending officers to review the terminal's surveillance tapes. The grainy footage did show a young woman, but closer inspection proved she was an out-of-state college student traveling home for the weekend. It was not Hannah. Another tip arrived from Detroit. A clothing store clerk reported that Hannah had come into her shop about a week after the disappearance, asking about jackets and looking as though she had been sleeping on the streets. At first, the account seemed promising. But under questioning, the clerk's story began to crumble. She contradicted herself several times and finally admitted she had seen Hannah's photo in the news and convinced herself she had seen her in person. This pattern repeated over and over. A cab driver swore he had driven Hannah across town that night. A bartender claimed she had stopped in for a drink with a man. A college student said he spotted her in a coffee shop in Lansing. Every lead raised hopes briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire on campus. Some students whispered that Hannah had run away, overwhelmed by her workload. Others suggested she had uncovered a dangerous story for the student paper, one that might have put her in harm's way. A few even speculated that she had left the country altogether. Detectives tried to keep the investigation focused, but each rumor consumed precious time. The lack of physical evidence made the work even harder. Hannah's apartment revealed no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no fingerprints belonging to anyone but her and her roommate. Her phone, the one device that might have provided a trail, had gone dark just after 11:15 that Thursday night. Her car sat untouched in the parking lot. Every path the detectives pursued ended in silence. For Hannah's family, the speculation was unbearable. Her mother stood outside press conferences, clutching her daughter's photograph and begging people not to spread lies. Her father grew frustrated with what he saw as wasted time, saying, "She did not run away. She did not leave because she wanted to. Someone knows where she is." By late November, the search had slowed. Volunteers who once filled the streets dwindled. Flyers began to curl and fade in the autumn rain. The story that had consumed the front pages was gradually pushed aside by new headlines. Within the Ann Arbor Police Department, detectives continued to meet, but each session ended with the same conclusion: no new evidence, no new suspects, no progress. By the spring of 2011, the investigation had reached a standstill. Hannah Blake had been gone for 6 months, and every promising lead had collapsed. The case was quietly moved to the shelves reserved for unsolved files, a cold acknowledgement that, without new evidence, Hannah's story might remain untold. The dead ends were more than failed leads. They represented the slow erosion of hope. And for the community of Ann Arbor, the silence left in the wake of Hannah's disappearance was almost as haunting as the night she vanished. For nearly a decade, the case of Hannah Blake remained frozen in the cold files of the Ann Arbor Police Department. Her photograph still lingered on a few bulletin boards, faded by sun and weather, but for most people on campus she had become a memory. New students arrived, graduated, and left without ever hearing her name. To her family, though, the silence was unbearable. Every year on October 7th, they held a small vigil, lighting candles and praying that someone, somewhere, would finally come forward. Nothing ever changed. Then, in the autumn of 2020, everything shifted. On the east side of Ann Arbor, a former student boarding house was scheduled for renovation. The once crowded building had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its halls filled with dust. A local property developer had purchased it, planning to convert it into apartments. On a cold morning in October, a team of construction workers entered the house to begin demolition. As they tore down the rotting plaster and wood, one worker's crowbar struck something unexpected. Behind a false wall, in what had once been a storage room, they uncovered a hidden cavity. Inside the dark space sat a worn canvas backpack, sealed by time. The workers paused, uneasy. Inside the bag were notebooks, a set of apartment keys, and a faded student ID card. The name, printed in bold letters, sent a chill through the room. Hannah Blake. Police were called immediately. Detectives, who had long since moved on to other cases, now rushed back to a name they had not spoken in years. Forensic teams carefully removed the backpack and its contents. The items had been untouched for a decade, protected by the sealed wall. Among the belongings were Hannah's handwritten notes, some pages filled with half-formed article ideas, others with fragments of personal reflections. At the bottom of the bag lay a small, spiral-bound diary. Inside the diary, investigators found a troubling set of entries. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Hannah had written about feeling watched. She described a sense that someone was following her between the newsroom and her apartment. One entry, dated October 3rd, read, "I don't know if I am imagining it, but I keep seeing the same man near the dorm. He knows where I live." But the most important discovery was not the diary or the notebooks. It was something smaller, almost overlooked. Tucked into the lining of the backpack was a single strand of hair, long and light-colored. It did not match Hannah's dark brown hair. Investigators preserved it carefully, knowing that modern DNA technology had advanced far beyond what was possible in 2010. When news of the discovery broke, the community was stunned. 10 years had passed with no trace of Hannah, and now her missing backpack had appeared sealed inside a wall of a student house less than a mile from where she lived. The revelation ignited fresh headlines, renewed vigils, and reignited the pain for her family. Hannah's mother, now visibly aged by a decade of grief, told reporters, "We always believed she was close. We never thought she had just disappeared into nothing. This proves someone wanted her hidden." For detectives, the breakthrough was both promising and haunting. How had Hannah's belongings ended up sealed inside a wall? Who had access to the student house at the time? And why had this evidence been hidden for so long, just blocks away from where the search had begun? The answers lay within the backpack, in the words Hannah had written, and in the strand of hair preserved in its lining. For the first time in 10 years, investigators felt the case shift from silence to possibility. A forgotten student house had unlocked a door to the truth, and what lay beyond would change everything. The backpack recovered from the sealed wall was treated as sacred evidence. Forensic teams transported it to the Michigan State Police Crime Laboratory, where every item was cataloged, photographed, and analyzed. After a decade of silence, investigators finally had something new to work with, and the hope in the air was palpable. The first items examined were Hannah's notebooks. Most pages contained ordinary student material, lists of assignments, outlines for class projects, reminders about deadlines. But scattered among them were cryptic notes. Some referenced an article Hannah had been researching about unsafe housing in Ann Arbor. Others hinted at something more personal. One sentence read simply, "He waits outside." Another entry said, "I know he has been in the building." Detectives debated whether Hannah had been documenting a source for her article or leaving a warning in case something happened to her. Then came the diary. Written in Hannah's neat, slanted handwriting, the entries provided a chilling window into her final days. In early October, just 4 days before she vanished, she wrote, "I can hear someone in the hallway when I come home. No one is there when I look." 2 days later, she noted, "I think someone followed me from the newsroom. Same hooded sweatshirt, same shoes. I crossed the street, but he did too." The final entry, dated October 6th, the night before she disappeared, read, "I cannot shake the feeling he is closer now. I will tell someone soon." The weight of those words settled over the investigators. Hannah had sensed danger. She had been documenting her fear, yet no one around her had realized the gravity of what she was experiencing. The breakthrough, however, came from something almost invisible. In the laboratory, technicians carefully examined the lining of the backpack. Embedded in a seam, they discovered a single long strand of blonde hair. It did not belong to Hannah, who had dark brown hair. Under the microscope, the root of the hair was intact, offering the potential for a full DNA profile. In 2010, the technology to extract and compare such a profile was limited, often unreliable with degraded samples. But by 2020, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Analysts were able to recover a complete DNA sequence from the strand. When compared to the National CODIS database, however, there was no direct match. Whoever had left the hair had never been arrested for a crime that required a DNA sample. Rather than seeing this as a dead end, investigators turned to a newer, more powerful tool, forensic genealogy. By uploading the profile to genealogical databases, they could search for relatives, however distant, who shared segments of DNA with the unknown individual. Within weeks, analysts identified a cluster of matches pointing to families in western Michigan. Using family trees, birth records, and census data, genealogists narrowed the possibilities down to one particular surname. Detectives were cautious but intrigued. For the first time since 2010, They had a lead that was rooted not in rumor, but in science. A hidden strand of hair, sealed away in a wall for 10 years, was pointing them toward a living person. Someone connected to Hannah's disappearance had left behind a trace that could not lie. For Hannah's family, the discovery brought a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that answers were finally within reach. Dread that the truth might confirm their worst fears about betrayal, secrets, and someone far closer to Hannah than they had ever imagined. The clues were no longer whispers in notebooks or faded flyers. They were tangible, scientific, undeniable, and with them, detectives were about to open the darkest chapter of the investigation. The discovery of the blonde hair inside Hannah Blake's backpack was the moment investigators had been waiting for. It was fragile, almost weightless, yet it carried the potential to unlock a mystery that had remained sealed for more than 10 years. In the sterile rooms of the Michigan State Police Crime Laboratory, technicians worked meticulously, aware that one mistake could destroy the only real lead in a decade. The DNA sequence was successfully extracted and built into a full profile. But when uploaded into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, the result came back empty. The unknown contributor had never been arrested for a serious crime in the United States, which meant there was no direct match. For many years, that would have been the end of the road. But this was no longer 2010. It was 2020, and investigators now had access to forensic genealogy, a revolutionary method that had already helped solve dozens of cold cases across the country. The DNA profile was uploaded into a genealogical database that allowed law enforcement to compare the unknown profile against those submitted voluntarily by individuals seeking to learn about their ancestry. The first results came back within days. At first glance, they appeared modest. Third and fourth cousins scattered across Michigan and neighboring states. None of them were close enough relatives to identify a suspect directly. But taken together, they provided the skeleton of a family tree. Professional genealogists began mapping out the connections, using birth records, marriage licenses, and obituaries to piece together generational links. Slowly, branches of the tree began to converge. After weeks of analysis, one surname rose to the surface: Lawson. The hair belonged to someone from the Lawson family line, a name not previously tied to the investigation. Detectives dug deeper. Among the possible relatives, one stood out: a man named Christopher Lawson, 29 years old at the time Hannah vanished. He had lived less than 2 miles from Hannah's apartment in 2010. Even more troubling, records showed that he had once volunteered during the original search efforts, handing out flyers and walking alongside other students looking for Hannah. Investigators began to retrace Christopher Lawson's life. He had worked odd jobs after dropping out of college, moving frequently between rentals in Ann Arbor. He had minor offenses on his record, nothing serious enough to require a DNA sample, but enough to show brushes with the law: trespassing, disorderly conduct, petty theft. Nothing in those records tied him to Hannah. Yet the DNA evidence suggested otherwise. Detectives decided to proceed carefully. They placed Lawson under surveillance, following his movements discreetly. Weeks passed before they saw an opportunity. One afternoon, after leaving a cafe, Lawson discarded a half-empty soda can in a public trash bin. Investigators collected it, sending it straight to the lab. The results were conclusive. The DNA from the soda can matched the blonde hair found in Hannah's backpack. There was no longer any doubt. Christopher Lawson had been in direct contact with Hannah Blake's belongings, and by extension, likely with Hannah herself, on the night she vanished. When confronted with the evidence, Lawson denied everything. He claimed he had never known Hannah, never met her, and had no idea how his DNA could have been found on her possessions. But investigators knew his story did not hold. He had lived nearby. He had been present during the searches, and his family's DNA had led directly to him. For the first time in 10 years, detectives had a name, a face, and hard evidence. The case of Hannah Blake was no longer just a mystery sealed in a wall. It was pointing directly at a man who had once blended into the crowd, pretending to search for her while knowing all along where the truth was buried. When investigators finally placed a name to the DNA profile, it was more than just a scientific breakthrough. It was a chilling revelation. Christopher Lawson was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a familiar face, someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Hannah's classmates and neighbors in the frantic days after she disappeared. In October of 2010, Lawson had presented himself as a concerned volunteer. He walked with students who searched the wooded trails, stapled flyers to telephone poles, and even spoke briefly with reporters, offering sympathetic words about a community coming together. At the time, his presence seemed unremarkable. In retrospect, it looked like something else entirely. Detectives began reconstructing Lawson's life during the months surrounding Hannah's disappearance. He had been 29 years old, significantly older than most of the students he mingled with. He lived in a small rented house less than 2 miles from Hannah's apartment. He worked part-time as a mechanic and occasionally picked up shifts as a delivery driver. There was nothing in his record to tie him directly to violent crime. Yet people who knew him described him as volatile, quick to anger, and socially isolated. The connection between Lawson and Hannah was not immediately clear. Detectives wondered if they had crossed paths at a cafe, in class, or through mutual acquaintances. Then, they discovered something that shifted the investigation again. Property records revealed that Lawson had once lived in the very same boarding house where Hannah's backpack was eventually discovered. In 2009 and 2010, he had rented a room there before moving a short distance away. He had intimate knowledge of the building, its walls, and its hidden spaces. The realization struck investigators hard. The backpack had not simply been discarded. It had been deliberately concealed in a wall of a house Lawson once called home. Only someone who knew the structure intimately could have hidden it there without attracting attention. The implication was unavoidable. Lawson had kept Hannah's belongings close, hiding them in a place he thought would never be touched. When police spoke again with Hannah's former friends and classmates, a disturbing detail emerged. Several remembered Lawson being around more than they first realized. Some recalled him appearing at gatherings in the weeks after Hannah vanished, offering condolences and asking questions about the investigation. One classmate described him as overly interested, almost too curious. At the time, it had been easy to dismiss. Now it seemed like a deliberate attempt to monitor the investigation and gauge whether suspicion might fall on him. For Hannah's family, the revelation was devastating. They had always assumed that whoever took their daughter had remained hidden, someone unknown and faceless. To learn that a man who had once stood among them, pretending to help, might have been responsible was almost unbearable. Her mother said quietly, "He walked with us while we searched. He looked me in the eye and told me he was sorry. All the while, he knew." Detectives felt both triumph and anger. The triumph came from finally naming a suspect, the anger from realizing how close he had been all along. Lawson had inserted himself into the heart of the search, blending into the community while concealing his secret. The strategy was not uncommon among offenders, but it still sent a shiver through everyone who reviewed the case. Christopher Lawson was no longer just a name pulled from a genealogical tree. He was a man who had walked freely among the grieving, who had hidden evidence inside walls, and who had evaded justice for an entire decade. The familiar face of a volunteer was now the face of their prime suspect. When investigators finally brought Christopher Lawson into custody, they knew they were facing a critical moment. The DNA evidence tied him directly to Hannah Blake's belongings, but what they needed was a confession, or at least inconsistencies in his story that could break him open. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. A single camera fixed on the table. Lawson sat with his arms folded, his eyes darting between the detectives who now held his future in their hands. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he had never met Hannah, never spoken to her, never set foot near her apartment. When presented with photographs of the backpack discovered inside the wall of his former residence, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "I don't know anything about that," he muttered. "People leave stuff behind all the time. It does not mean it has anything to do with me." Detectives pressed harder. They reminded him that the hair found in the lining of the backpack matched his DNA exactly. They laid the laboratory report on the table in front of him. Still, Lawson deflected. He suggested that maybe someone else in his family had been involved. Maybe the DNA was a coincidence. Maybe it had been planted. His voice grew defensive, his answers clipped. The detectives shifted their approach. Instead of hammering him with accusations, they leaned into silence, letting the weight of the evidence hang in the air. One of them read aloud excerpts from Hannah's diary, describing how she felt watched, how she saw the same man in a hooded sweatshirt following her. Each word seemed to pull Lawson deeper into unease. His hands tightened, his eyes flicked toward the camera, and sweat began to gather on his forehead. Finally, after hours of back and forth, Lawson cracked. He admitted that he had known Hannah casually, though he insisted it was only in passing. He claimed he had offered her a ride once, that he had looked out for her around campus. When asked why his DNA was inside her backpack, he said she had borrowed a jacket from him, and maybe the hair had transferred then. Detectives immediately noted the contradiction. He had started by insisting he did not know her at all, and now he was suggesting he had been close enough to lend her clothing. As the hours wore on, his story shifted again. This time, he placed blame elsewhere. He claimed Hannah had been seeing another student, someone he refused to name at first. Under pressure, he finally spoke the name: Michael Trent, Hannah's ex-boyfriend. Lawson insisted Michael had orchestrated the entire thing, and that he, Lawson, had only been caught on the edges. "I did not hurt her," he repeated. "He did. He made me help hide her stuff." Detectives listened but did not believe him outright. The strategy was transparent. By introducing another suspect, Lawson was trying to dilute responsibility. Still, his claim forced investigators to reopen threads they had set aside years before. Michael Trent, once only a person of interest with a shaky alibi, was suddenly back in focus. The interrogation ended without a confession, but Lawson had given them something just as valuable: contradictions, inconsistencies, and the first direct link between himself, Hannah, and another member of her circle. His words may have been lies, but they contained enough detail to shift the trajectory of the case. When Lawson was escorted back to his holding cell, detectives gathered in the observation room. One of them said quietly, "He is not telling the truth, but he is telling us enough." The arrest of Christopher Lawson was only the beginning. For investigators, the next step was clear. They had to determine whether Lawson had acted alone, or if Hannah Blake's disappearance was the result of more than one man's secret. The interrogation of Christopher Lawson had not given detectives the clean confession they wanted, but it had cracked open a new path. His shifting stories and desperate attempt to place blame on Michael Trent, Hannah's former boyfriend, forced investigators to reconsider something they had not seriously pursued in years: the possibility that more than one person had been involved in Hannah Blake's disappearance. Detectives began revisiting the evidence with fresh eyes. Hannah's diary entries described being followed repeatedly. She mentioned a hooded man outside the dorm, but also wrote cryptically about hearing two voices in the hallway on one night just days before she vanished. At the time, this detail had seemed too vague to pursue. Now it carried new weight. They re-examined phone records from the night of October 7th, 2010. Hannah's final outgoing call had been to Michael Trent at 11:14 in the evening, lasting less than half a minute. Trent had always maintained the call was insignificant, claiming he could not remember what was said. With Lawson now pointing toward him, investigators looked closer. Cell tower data placed Trent's phone in the vicinity of his friend's apartment that night, but there was a brief window when his location data dropped offline, a gap of nearly 20 minutes. It was not proof, but it suggested he could have left and returned without detection. Witness statements were also reanalyzed. One neighbor had spoken of hurried footsteps followed by a door slam. Another mentioned hearing voices raised in argument. If two men had been involved, both details could align with what happened inside the building that night. Detectives interviewed Lawson again, pressing him on the details of Trent's alleged role. He claimed Trent had been furious that Hannah continued to avoid him. According to Lawson's version, Trent confronted Hannah in the hallway of her building, and Lawson was drawn in after the fact. "I tried to calm him down," Lawson insisted, "but he was the one who snapped." When asked how Hannah's belongings ended up sealed in a wall of a house Lawson once lived in, he faltered, mumbling that he had only done what Trent told him to do. Forensic analysis continued to add pressure. A new examination of the blonde hair confirmed it was Lawson's, but trace evidence from the backpack revealed a second DNA profile, degraded but usable. When compared against Trent's known sample, it aligned. The probability of it belonging to him was overwhelming. The scientific link between Hannah's belongings and both men was now established. The theory that emerged was chilling. Hannah had been lured or confronted by Trent on the night she vanished. Lawson, who lived nearby and had knowledge of the student boarding house, assisted either in the confrontation itself or in the cover-up afterward. Together, they had hidden her possessions in a place Lawson believed would never be uncovered. Detectives now had enough to build a case for conspiracy. They no longer viewed Hannah's disappearance as the work of a lone predator. It was the act of two men, bound by secrecy, covering each other's tracks for a decade. For Hannah's parents, the news was devastating. The idea that more than one person had betrayed their daughter cut deeply. Her mother asked, "How could two people carry this for so many years? How could they sit across from us, lie to us, and pretend to help?" The theory of an accomplice shifted the investigation into its final stage. With DNA evidence tying both men to Hannah's belongings, detectives prepared to make the arrests that the community had been waiting for since the night of October 7th, 2010. By the winter of 2021, the investigation had reached its turning point. Detectives had spent months building a case that tied both Christopher Lawson and Michael Trent to Hannah Blake's disappearance. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. DNA connected them both to her belongings. Hannah's diary supported the timeline of her fear, and Lawson's own contradictions placed him at the scene. The time for suspicion had ended. It was time to act. The first arrest came quietly. On a cold January morning, officers surrounded Lawson's small rented house on the outskirts of Ann Arbor. He was taken into custody without resistance, wearing the same detached expression he had carried during earlier interviews. Inside his home, detectives found little of value, just a cluttered space filled with old newspapers and tools. But the arrest itself was the message. The man who once blended in with volunteers, who handed out flyers and offered hollow condolences, was now accused of the crime he had pretended to mourn. The arrest of Michael Trent was more explosive. Detectives coordinated it carefully, knowing that his connection to Hannah was more personal and likely to provoke strong reaction. He was tracked to his apartment near Lansing, where he had been living quietly for years, working in sales. When officers knocked on his door, he appeared stunned. His first words were not of denial but of confusion. "This is about Hannah, isn't it?" he asked. That single line told detectives what they already suspected. Trent had carried the weight of guilt for over a decade. Both men were booked and charged. Lawson faced counts of accessory to murder and tampering with evidence. Trent faced the far graver charge of first-degree murder. The courtroom documents laid out the theory clearly. On the night of October 7th, 2010, Trent had confronted Hannah outside her apartment. Lawson, who lived nearby, became involved either during or immediately after the confrontation. Together, they concealed her belongings, attempting to erase her presence and mislead investigators. News of the arrests spread quickly across Michigan. For residents of Ann Arbor, the shock was not only that suspects had finally been named, but that both men were already known to them. Lawson had been a volunteer in the search. Trent had been the ex-boyfriend everyone had whispered about in 2010. But for years he had seemed untouchable, his alibi strong enough to deflect suspicion. To see his name printed on arrest warrants was surreal. The Blake family, while relieved, struggled with the emotions of the moment. Hannah's father told reporters, "This is what we prayed for, but it does not feel like victory. It feels like confirmation of our worst fears." Her mother could not bring herself to speak publicly, instead sitting silently at the vigil held after the arrests, clutching a candle and shaking her head. In the days following the arrests, details leaked. Detectives had recovered additional evidence from the storage unit once rented by Lawson, remnants of duct tape, a box of women's clothing, and handwritten notes linking him to the student house where the backpack had been found. None of these items could be tied directly to Hannah, but they painted a picture of a man obsessed with control. Trent's reaction under questioning was even more revealing. When confronted with Lawson's statement placing him at the scene, he lashed out, calling Lawson a liar and a coward. But his anger betrayed him. He knew details that only someone present that night could have known. Detectives documented every word, confident that a jury would hear it one day. The arrests of Lawson and Trent marked the beginning of the end of the case. What had once been a mystery carved in silence was now unraveling in real time. Two men, bound by guilt and deception, were finally facing justice. But the true reckoning was still ahead, waiting inside a courtroom where Hannah Blake's name would echo once more. The trial of Christopher Lawson and Michael Trent began in the spring of 2022 inside the Washtenaw County Courthouse. By then, more than 11 years had passed since the night Hannah Blake disappeared. The courtroom was packed on the first day, filled with reporters, students who still remembered Hannah's face on missing posters, and community members who had carried the mystery for over a decade. At the front of the gallery sat her parents, hands clasped tightly together, bracing themselves for the long-awaited search for justice. The prosecution built its case around science and betrayal. They presented the DNA evidence that placed both men in direct contact with Hannah's belongings. The blonde hair, the degraded strand linked to Trent, and the discarded soda can that matched Lawson's profile were all laid bare in front of the jury. They displayed Hannah's diary entries, her words documenting the growing fear that she was being followed. They reminded the jury of Lawson's contradictions in interrogation, how he shifted from denial to partial admission, and then to blaming Trent. And they highlighted Trent's personal connection, the ex-boyfriend who had never accepted the end of their relationship and who had spoken words that only someone at the scene could have known. The defense teams fought desperately. Lawson's attorney painted him as a troubled man caught in the gravity of Trent's obsession. He was, they argued, an accessory at most, a man who made poor choices but was not responsible for Hannah's death. Trent's defense was even more aggressive. They attacked the reliability of the DNA, questioned the chain of custody, and suggested that Lawson had planted evidence to protect himself. They tried to portray Hannah as reckless, implying she had led both men on and placed herself in danger. Each attempt was met with outrage from the gallery, and the judge frequently called for order. Witnesses took the stand. Former classmates testified about Hannah's character, her ambition, and the fear she had expressed in the days before she vanished. Construction workers described the moment they found her backpack sealed in the wall. Forensic experts carefully explained the genealogy process that had traced Lawson's DNA through distant relatives. Piece by piece, the puzzle was laid before the jury. The emotional climax came when Hannah's parents testified. Her mother spoke of the decade of silence, of birthdays and holidays marked by absence, of the endless waiting for answers. Her father's voice broke as he recalled searching the streets of Ann Arbor night after night, hoping to find his daughter alive. Their words anchored the case not in science or speculation, but in the raw pain of a family who had lost everything. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Their verdict was unanimous. Michael Trent was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher Lawson was found guilty of accessory to murder and evidence tampering. He received a sentence of 25 years. As the sentences were read, Hannah's parents wept silently. The community reacted with a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but no verdict could bring Hannah back. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Hannah's father how he felt. He paused for a long moment before answering. "Justice is not closure. It is only recognition of the truth. My daughter deserved more than this ending, but at least the lies are finished." The trial closed a chapter that had haunted Ann Arbor for more than a decade. 2 men who once walked freely among the search parties, who looked Hannah's family in the eye, were now behind bars. And the name Hannah Blake, once written on missing posters curling in the rain, was spoken in courtrooms and headlines again, not as a mystery, but as a young woman whose story had finally been told. For more than 10 years, Hannah Blake's name lived only on faded flyers and in unanswered questions. The discovery inside a hidden wall and the DNA evidence that followed finally revealed the truth. Justice was served, but her absence will never fade. Cold cases remind us that silence is not the same as closure. The truth always finds a way forward. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us as we uncover more cases that prove time cannot keep every secret buried.